All righty. Thanks for coming. We're going to talk a little bit about one of our next proposals for our special session. We're working on a series of items. We've already talked about repealing the state tax and health savings accounts. We've talked about transforming the State Department of Commerce into an economic development corporation. Looking ahead, we've got other provisions we're working on. We'll be announcing in the coming days about the small business tax cut and about relief from the high cost of lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits in the state. But today we're going to talk about part of our package, and there are other things to come in this, but a couple of the highlights in terms of the package we're going to be presenting to the state legislature as part of the special session on easing the cost of regulation in the state. Probably as much as anything, in many cases even more so than complaints about the high tax burden in Wisconsin. I've heard concerns from small business owners all across the state who point out the cost of complying with excessive regulations is something that's a significant challenge to them and their businesses. And so we want to provide relief for that. And one of the biggest things is that here in Wisconsin, we have one of the broadest sets of parameters when it comes to the administrative code process in the state of Wisconsin, and we want to highlight some changes with that. So I've got, in fact, prop-wise, do I have the codes up here?
The specific code?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can bring them up.
Yeah, I'm going to show them. They're just sitting around over there. We're going to give you an example of showing you the difference of that. But the administrative code in this state has the full force of law. And so to ensure that the administrative code changes that are put forward in the future, we're proposing a number of changes in the statute, which would encompass a series of things. First off, tightening up the parameters so that it is clear for every state agency that those changes have to be in compliance with the intent that the legislature set forth in the original statutes. Right now, again, you can have two different ways of having the impact on something that has the force of law. You can have the state legislature passing something, the governor signing off on it. That obviously creates a new chapter in the state statutes that has the full force of law in the state. That's one way to make a change. Another is through a state agency proposing a change, an amendment to the administrative code. There's a limited passive review process. It's fairly broad and encompassing, in fact, much broader than it is in many other states across the country. And that has sort of quite extraordinary action by the legislature through a passive review process. Short of that change, that would have the full impact of law within the state of Wisconsin. We're trying to tighten that up. So one change is having it more clearly defined that it has to meet with the parameters set forward by the legislature. The other change involves the governor's office, not only for me but for future governors, putting in the statute that any change that's proposed through the administrative code process not only has to comply with what the legislature said in the first place, but ultimately has to be approved by the governor's office. And the idea being with that's the final check and balance, much as the governor with a piece of legislation has the final ability to veto that. This too would have the same impact in terms of being that final check and balance. The other change we're talking about along with those two is right now, if an individual citizen wants to change and challenge the administrative code of any given state agency, they have to do so in the circuit court just across the way here in Dane County. We think it's appropriate for our citizens to have access no matter where they live, whether it's in Milwaukee County or Pepin County or anywhere in between, particularly the further away from Dane County that a citizen lives. It's appropriate that they should be able to challenge that. And we're only probably talking about a limited number of cases, at least according to common practice, but challenge that in any of the 72 counties here in the state of Wisconsin, not just in Dane County. And so to that extent, we want to make that change as well. Now, there are other changes we're working on with Margaret Farrell and Susan Marks have been working with small business leaders from across the state to talk about changes. We've been working with organizations that represent small businesses here in the state of Wisconsin, and we want to make sure we incorporate other changes, but those are some of the big things we're doing to try and rein in authority so that ultimately we're responsive to the people of the state. And that if there's going to be something that has the impact of law, it's something that the 132 people who are duly elected in the state legislature ultimately have a direct say on, as does the governor, who's elected by all the people of the state of Wisconsin. Is that? I'll entertain some questions if you got them.
Can you give us an example of maybe something you've heard of regulation that had it gone through this process would have been different, or just
Yeah.
sometimes
Well, we've had in the Department of Commerce, ironically, which is part of the reason why I want to change to the Department of Commerce into something that's more about promoting commerce than just about regulating. But I've had builders, home builders, bring up to me changes that were made years ago where they've got a whole division that regulates building, and where they had a wind bracing requirement that has them build homes to the level of a hurricane. Well, obviously, I don't think any of us have seen a hurricane here in the state of Wisconsin. We have had standards in the past that ensure that it can withstand tornadoes and high winds and flooding and things of that nature. Many of these home builders have brought that to our attention. We said they questioned why that happened, and nobody could give them a specific answer as to why they need to build it to that level. Again, these are the sorts of things that if we kind of had a final check, and if it was more narrowly defined to comply with the legislative intent, I believe those are things that would get weeded out in the process early on.
Scott, if the agencies are being led by your political appointees, why would you then need to have it come to your desk? Because hypothetically, these are your cabinet members that would be overseeing these changes.
Yeah, a couple different things. One, in having served in the legislature, I remember seeing this in the past, but certainly this will help us. Just having this in the statutes, I think, will help reduce the number of requests for administrative law changes in the first place, which will streamline the process. So the things that do need to happen will probably happen more quickly. But for your question, long-term, putting this in the statute ensures that not only for me as governor, but for any future governor, that there's a process. I saw in the legislature where an idea that started out might have been reasonable. As it was built throughout the process, it kind of got carried away. This would give one last check so that, again, someone who's elected and responsive to the voters has to be held accountable for making that decision and not just kind of passed off as, well, that's something the bureaucracy did. Really, the best way to describe this is about empowering the people through their elected representatives, and if anything, it's taking power away from the unelected bureaucracy and making sure that people who have to be accountable to the voters are the ones who ultimately have the final say.
So speaking on that last point, the Democrats came out today and accused you of doing a power grab. What do you make of that allegation?
No, I mean, in the end, this is about empowering voters, empowering the citizens of the state, and ultimately empowering elected officials, not just the governor, but by ensuring the very start of this process has to be something that can only go forward and comply with the intent of the elected representatives in the state assembly and state senate as to how they passed it. This is something that empowers elected officials to ultimately be accountable to the public.
Is there a concern, though, that people who are maybe writing these, so bureaucrats,
Yeah.
people, that they're going to have to consider the political implications? So they're going to have to maybe start vote counting, and, well, is the governor, I mean, does it put politics in something that shouldn't really be political?
No, I think, again, it puts accountability back in. If you're going to see changes met, these are changes that can't be narrowly defined within a vacuum. Again, with all due respect, and this is not beating up on people in the bureaucracy, but one state agency might have a narrow focus and not see the implications it has not only on other parts of state government, but it has on the citizens of the state of Wisconsin. Again, as elected officials, we have a larger responsibility than just one state agency. We have to make sure that things work as much as possible for all the people of the state of Wisconsin. So, again, if anything, what I think it will do is make sure that there's a broader consideration to things that have the full force of law. Again, when you look at the administrative code book and you look at the state statutes, it's hard to tell the difference to the average citizen who would see them, in a judge's quarters or in a law firm or things of that nature. It's because they both have the full force of the law. The only difference is one is voted on by those people duly elected. The other has much more of a pass or review process. We want to make sure that that process is one that's as accountable to the public as possible.
Scott, are there any rules, regs, or code changes that were adopted over the last year or two that you want rescinded? I mean, you're speaking about the process going forward. Anything you want to back up and take off?
Yeah, we're going to look through all those, once we get going with our cabinet and the new administration. Today I'm not going to go through a laundry list of those, but believe me, there are things that need to be modified. altered, not only through the administrative code process, but probably the vast majority of those changes, Steve, we'll be making not just through modifications of administrative code, but through outright statutory changes. Because again, to me, the more we can define things in the statute, it's the better route for two reasons. One, most importantly, it's something where the public can hold someone accountable. It has to be passed, and the statutory change has to be passed by lawmakers and the majority of the 132 elected in the Assembly and the Senate, and signed off by the governor. The other reason is it stands the test of time, you know, in the sense that it's something that's in the statutes, it's defined there. It's not something that can be as easily altered if that is indeed a change that, to me, some of the changes that need to come into play are things that you don't just want temporarily, you want a long-term change.
But you're not naming anything adopted by DNR or ag or anything?
Oh, there are plenty of things out there I'd like to review, but again, process-wise, the reason I'm not bringing it up today is this is not about a laundry list of all the things I want to change. This is about establishing a process to ensure that the things maybe I have a problem with and others have a problem with would be reined in long before they happen. Again, another message, really, when we're trying to convey a message to small business owners that Wisconsin's open for business, one of the best ways we can do that is to say the people who you elected, the people who you're going to hold accountable, are ultimately going to have more say in making sure the rules that come out of the administrative code are ones that work for all the people of Wisconsin.
And you're arguing that the status quo is inhibiting job creation.
I do. And again, I would argue, and it gets into some of the specifics Steve was talking about, but more often than not, when I've heard from small business owners across the state about the things that are a barrier to them creating more jobs in the state, when you pry into that on the campaign trail and in the month and a half since the election, it was things that weren't just about statutory changes, they were about changes to the administrative code. They were things, as the example I gave with the wind bracing, I heard from time and time again from home builders. There are plenty of other examples, and it's not just with employers. You even hear, you know, concerns from, for example, from local government officials about the phosphorus mandate. Here, I'm giving you one more example. I'm not going to go into the laundry list, but they would tell you that's going to cost local governments tens of millions of dollars. Now, we want clean water in this state. There's certainly value to that. I think I and those local government officials would agree with that. But that's a good example where a rule went forward, and many of them would argue it didn't fully account for the cost implications to those local governments. As elected officials, we've got to balance all those things. The need to meet that challenge at the same time, doing it in a way that doesn't break the bank for local governments. Those are things I think where, again, when you get elected officials more involved, we've got a larger universe of people we've got to be accountable to, and we have to balance all those interests out.
Everyone fall into this? I mean, the DOJ fall into this, and EPI?
Uh-huh. Yep. All state agencies. The reason why is those same state agencies can't make changes ultimately in terms of the statutes without the legislature and the governor acting on those as well. So if it requires a statutory change to get things done, the legislature and the governor have to sign off on those. To me, the same thing should apply to the administrative code process. Anything that has the rule of law behind it should be something that the elected officials of the state have to be involved in. Now, excuse me, you know, just so it's clear, we talk about administrative rules, administrative code. This isn't, for example, how you run your office. This isn't, you know, how you interact with your staff. This isn't about, you know, the administration process itself. This is about the administrative code, which is, again, I can't emphasize enough, are things that in the state of Wisconsin have the full force of law behind them and have ramifications on citizens all across the state. And that's where we draw the line in saying it should apply to every state agency.
Would it apply to like memos, like administrative memos from DOJ, like the Attorney General hands down a memo? Is that what we're talking about? Or just
No. Right now, those sorts of things, I mean, things that are already, and remember, we already, even back to that DOJ and Department of Public Instruction example, those agencies are already under the administrative code. There's a much more difficult process to hold people accountable on, but there still is a process. The legislature can still, through a passive review process, object and ultimately have modifications made to those rules, even though those are agencies head, in the two cases you gave, independently elected officials. So they already have to comply with that now. We're not adding a new standard that's already there. The difference is we're saying instead of it just being a passive review process, there should be a forthright, aggressive, upfront process that says that every administrative code, every change that we make in this state that has the full force of law should be something that the elected officials of the state have a direct impact on.
Scott, talk about the politics of this for a second. The Democrats are saying that this is just political kickback, that your big campaign donations from the WMC, the Chambers of Commerce, big business, and now you're rewarding them with these rule changes. How would you respond to that?
Well, I'd say the bottom line is the biggest group I heard from on this are small business owners. They're the ones that are affected the most. And if there's any politics in it, I'll tell you the direct politics are, I campaigned on a pledge of creating 250,000 jobs. I plan on meeting that. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is empowering our small businesses in the state to go ahead and do their business, get their job done, not be over-restricted by the government, and instead be able to do what they do best. Produce things, make things, grow things, get the job done.
Have you run this at all, mention this at all to Van Hollen or Ebers? I mean, because you mentioned the elected, people clearly elected. I mean, so do you expect maybe some sort of pushback from them?
It's possible, but again, in the end, we're not subjecting, right now, any rule that they propose, their agencies propose, still has to go through the current administrative code process. We're not adding a new process in place. We're trying to make it more accountable to the public. That's the difference there.
Is there anything, will there be anything in the language that would put a timeline to this? Because if the legislature's not in session, and let's say somebody desperately needs to get through, so short of you have to call a special session, or, I mean, how does that work? Because some of these things could be time sensitive.
Well, again, they have parameters right now in terms of the past review process. What we're doing in terms of defining the role of the legislature is saying that the scope to begin with has to comply with the parameters set by the legislature in terms of statutory changes. So we're kind of setting, more clearly defining what can be proposed as an administrative code change in the first place. Then, at the tail end, we're adding one more process to say that the governor's office ultimately has to sign off on it. But certainly we're going to be in consultation with every state agency, whether it's under my cabinet or under somebody else who's independently elected, to make sure that we're providing a timely response to those. And the other thing to remember on this is this, I believe, will reduce the number of requests in the first place. So you won't get some of these, what many might argue to be more frivolous or more overly broad requests for administrative code changes. So the ones that are recommended to begin with are going to be important. We're going to be in consultation with every state agency in the beginning to try and focus in on the things that actually need to happen. So I doubt there's going to be a whole lot of surprises. And at the tail end, if there's something we have a concern about, we're going to let those state agencies know early and up front.
One more question?
Well, you mentioned broad. Yeah, I know you said you don't want to go through a laundry list, but I think it might be helpful if we know what you're talking about. You said so there wouldn't be broad ranging. Is there maybe a few other examples you can give us of how this would affect things that have been recently passed?
Well, again, I mean, the two I gave just as examples. One that came up from the campaign trail from small business was the wind bracing one. It's just a classic example, but you've got many of those all over the place. The other, the phosphorus, actually came from local government officials. In fact, started out with a group over in Outagamie County of town officials who talked about the literally tens of millions of dollars they're going to have to spend in terms of new wastewater treatment facilities and things of that nature that they're very concerned that they don't have capacity to afford and would like some alternatives. They're not saying don't apply the standard to us, but help us find some alternatives that they just didn't feel were a part of the administrative code process. To me, those are good examples of where, as elected officials, we're responsible for more than just administering one provision within one department or one state agency. We're responsible for balancing the needs and interests of all the people of the state and trying to put that in place that works for everyone here. Again, I think that's where it's helpful to have elected officials in the legislature and the governor more actively involved.
Thanks.
Great, thanks.